Welcome to this special episode of The Flip Side. On this episode, we're going to be exploring different forms of national identity, looking at civic nationalism versus ethnic nationalism. Now, this one's a little bit different. Usually we've put people in conversation with one another to get a really lively debate going. But it's been quite a challenge getting these two sides to discuss with one another. But I'm very grateful that we do have two thinkers, but they will be separate. We'll first hear the argument of one speaker, and then following that, we'll hear the argument of the second speaker. So we're joined by Albie Amankona. He is a broadcaster and also founder of Conservatives Against Racism. And then we have Laurie Wastell, who is a writer and editor at the Daily Sceptic. Albie argues for a colourblind civic nationalist approach that centres British identity around British values, and he talks about what that means to him. He accepts that, or he contends that immigration has been too high over the last decade, but he thinks the focus should be on how we then integrate those that are already here, and we should not become anxious or nervous too much about ethnic demographic change. It's worth noting, is a mixed race man himself. And then Laurie is someone that argues that we need an ethno-cultural majority in order to maintain a robust nation state. He argues that it is wrong and actually causing resentment that these kinds of discussions have been made taboo and shut down. And he thinks that you can believe in the necessity of having an ethno-cultural majority in the society and demographic policies specifically aimed to preserve a particular ethnic majority without necessarily being an ethno-nationalist and without being racist. So this is a really interesting discussion. And just to note, why are we having this discussion? Not just because it's thorny and multifaceted and complicated, all of those things we love to talk about, but because it has been something that has been resurging in the public debate in Britain. There was the controversy around the journalist Fraser Nelson saying Rishi Sunak was English, but the podcaster Konstantin Kisin saying that he wasn't, and that sparked a whole discussion about what does it mean to be English. And many people felt that it was a discussion that was already settled, that he was English, but many people thought that it was important to note that he wasn't ethnically English. And the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, famously wrote an article in the Telegraph saying that she will never be truly English because she does not have the ethnic ancestry. But also there has been the rise of something called the online right, which is a often anonymous, but not always, section of right-wing thought that has been growing in popularity in some sections, which discuss a lot about demographics, ethnicity, and are extremely worried about immigration to such an extent where they advocate for policies that are currently not within the Overton window, but may well be in the future, such as mass deportations, not just of foreign criminals or illegal migrants, but even perhaps British citizens of ethnic minority heritage that they perceive have not integrated. Now, there are obviously different sections of that particular group, but some even just say that ethnic minorities, regardless of if they're integrated or not, should be deported, and that post-Windrush was a problem. Now, again, that's not the views of all the people there, and it would be wrong to say that, but there is different factions of this particular kind of grouping. And there's also the research by Matthew Goodwin, who is a professor, he's an academic. He currently is at the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham, but I think he was previously at the University of Kent. He released research that white British people are set to become a minority in Britain by the end of the century. And this has sparked a lot of discussion about whether or not this is something that we should be concerned or worried about. and should we take measures to reverse it, if that's even possible. So there is a big context why we're having this discussion, and we're really grateful for the two speakers that we have to dive into many of the different areas. And we touched upon a lot of things, but there is no doubt much more to talk about. So thank you, Albie Amankona, for joining us on this podcast. We're really excited to have you. So I'm going to dive straight into it and ask you, what does Englishness mean to you? What makes someone English?
So my 2-minute introduction on what it means to be English is really rooted in this idea of civic nationalism rather than ethno-nationalism. And I studied a lot of history and economic history when I was at university, and really I don't think there's anything wrong with nationalism, but it's when that nationalism is based purely on ethnicity when we start to see some of the really big problems with nationalism emerging, whether or not we're talking about issues that have happened in continents like Africa, for example, like the Rwandan genocide, which was predicated on ethnicity, whether or not we're looking at things a little bit closer to home here in Europe, the atrocities that we saw in the early 20th century against Jewish people. When we start conflating national identity with purely ethnicity, if we look at history, at least, it can lead to some really rather horrific and hugely tragic outcomes. And so that is really my starting point. And that's why I believe when we ask this question, what does it mean to be English? I'm not the type of person who would make the argument that only white people can be English, that only people that have a British-born heritage that goes back however many hundreds of years can consider themselves English, because on that metric, people like our King Charles, wouldn't be English. People like our former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, wouldn't be English. And then as well, people that make those arguments that say people like Rishi Sunak can't be English, then you've got to ask the question, well, why is it that those people say that Rishi Sunak can't be English, but the King is English, that Boris Johnson is English? Because actually, if we look at all three of those people, they do have heritage which is not British born. Why is it that we only, or that some people would only focus on the person who is not white and being not English? And I think that is where the problem lies. So I think, what does it mean to be English? It means signing up to British values. I know lots of people have a problem with that phrase, British values. What does it mean? Where does it start? Where does it end? It's quite a nebulous term, but believing in things that this country believes in, a belief in liberal democracy, a belief in fairness, a love for this country, a love for the history of this country, wanting to integrate into this society. It's more than just having a piece of paper, a physical document saying that you are British. In fact, there's no physical document that says anyone is English, because we have British passports, not passports on the basis of the four nations. So I suppose some people might argue, well, none of us are really English. We're all British. But I wouldn't agree with that either. I think part of it also does come from place. You know, people that are born in England, of course they're English, in the same way that white South Africans born in South Africa are South African, the same as black Africans that moved over, or that were taken over to the West Indies, being born in Jamaica, are Jamaican. You get very few Jamaicans, even if they know that they have Nigerian heritage, saying they are only Nigerian. They will also say that they are Jamaican. So I think that nationality and place is more than just skin deep, and it always concerns me when people make arguments basically purely on the basis of skin colour.
Some people say Israel is a model of an ethnic nation, a nation that defines itself as a kind of Jewish homeland, that's also liberal and democratic. Why can't England be the same?
Well, there's a number of different things there. I think if you're going to use Israel as an example, then you're actually kind of making the point for me, right? What we saw in Israel is after the atrocities of the early 20th century, a lot of Jewish people that actually lived in other parts of the world, notably Europe, moved to what is now Israel and build a country of their own and identify as being Israelis, identify as being Middle Eastern, identify as being from that part of the world and building a culture, identifying with that culture, identifying with those values, and all coming together as a nation of Jewish people from different parts of the world that have come to a place that they can be safe and that they can call their own. And that's not that journey of immigration, if you will, obviously for different reasons, is not that dissimilar from people from ethnic minority backgrounds moving to European countries like the United Kingdom or France, for example, that has a very different attitude towards multiculturalism. In France, you don't get French Nigerians, they are French. That is certainly the French way of looking at things. And again, that French model of multiculturalism, if you will, again, sort of makes that point for me. So I think using Israel as an example of why non-white people can't be English is probably not the best example. Now, on the point about people not integrating into English society and English customs, I really do think that is a separate issue than the question that we're asking, what does it mean to be English? I don't think there's going to be much disagreement between me and someone who says that integration in some communities has not been complete enough and hasn't gone far enough, and it does feel like in some parts of the country, notably in lots of northern towns and towns outside of London, it does feel like there are parallel societies. My mum's family is from Oldham in Greater Manchester. You really can see it there in a way that you don't necessarily see it in London. That doesn't mean that the people who have integrated aren't English. Just because there's more work to do with some communities and integration doesn't mean that the communities that are well integrated, patriotic communities contributing to society, paying their taxes, voting in elections, following the laws of the land and following the customs and traditions of this country, that doesn't mean that those people like me are not English.
If someone is born here, are they automatically English though? What does integration mean in that case? If you look at some areas of the country that are, I think, have huge numbers, proportions that are Pakistani heritage, you go there and people are dressing in Pakistani ethnic clothing. Many of the shops are written in other languages, and they're also eating food and doing things that you would not associate with England. But if it's just about if people are born here, then how can we call that a failure of integration? Surely Englishness has to mean something more than just being born here.
Look, I think the pace of change, especially since 2019, has plainly been too fast. I mean, one year we had almost 1,906,000 net migration in 1 year, and that is just too high. People are feeling in some parts of the country that the face of their town is completely changing. The pace of change in this part of the 21st century has been so rapid, and that I think is a blight on the record of the last Conservative government that actually said they'd bring immigration down. So I completely understand people who say that the pace of change is too quick. On the future projections for the racial demography of the country, I think it really depends on how well integrated these people are into British society, and what actually is making up the pace of this change. Is it that we're seeing interracial relationships and interracial marriages leading to mixed race children? I am a mixed race child of an interracial family. I don't think the concern is about there being many more mixed-race children in the future. We do know that the mixed-race cohort is one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing racial cohort in the country. And I think that's something to celebrate and something to look at and think, yeah, this is where we're seeing multiculturalism working. Now, we are also seeing some instances where we're getting larger groups of the population who perhaps don't display those same British values as some, or English values, whatever we're talking about here, if we want to say British or English, and that is a problem. But we have to solve that problem, and I don't think by saying these people aren't English, these people aren't integrating into the British way of life. What's the nth degree of that comment? Is it that we're going to deport all of those people? Because if that's what you think, like, just come out and say it, and then let's talk about the mechanics of what that might look like. But then when we start talking about the mechanics of what that might look like, it starts to look and sound a lot like those bad outcomes from ethno-nationalism that I was talking about at the beginning of this podcast, that I think we can all agree led to some tragic, heinous and awful, actually, crimes against humanity that we've seen across the world. If that's what you think, come out and say it, and we can tackle that. I think it would be a brave person that would come out and say that. But if that's what you think, that's what you should say. That is the nth degree of what you are saying. If you believe there's a group of people in society that cannot be integrated into the British way of life, and therefore you think something should be done with them, which isn't trying to make them integrate, then I think you need to outline that point. It's not a point I would make. I think we need to do a lot better with integration. I think we've got to stop making it worse by bringing immigration numbers down, get a proper integration programme running. And that actually is where I think English culture can really make a difference, because I don't think English people fight for their culture in the same way that even other countries in the four nations of the UK fight for their culture: Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish, and kind of broader Irish identity. There's this squeamishness around Englishness. I even see it within my own family. I see the Ghanaian side of my family being a lot more vocal in their national pride than the English side of my family. And I always wonder why that is. I think that's where some of this culture actually can help. We need to start celebrating English celebrations, whether or not that's May Day, whether or not that's patron saint St George, whether or not that's the marching bands that go across the north of England. There are so many cultural things in this country that I don't think we celebrate enough. And I think those moments, those festivals, those celebrations that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years, can actually be focal points for this integration that I think we so desperately need.
I've kind of worried that, and I'm not just worried about this, I've written about this many times, that a lot of the notions of the progressive concepts such as white privilege and abolishing whiteness has really done more harm than good. I think that it is fueled an ethnic consciousness, in a defensive ethnic consciousness in some white Britons. And not just white Britons, you see this in the US as well, with discussions about, white genocide in South Africa. So do you believe in white privilege? Because I think I have seen you defend that concept in the past. And do you agree that identity politics has backfired?
So on the subject of white privilege, I think that it might be able to describe a phenomenon that feels true in some situations, but I actually think the term white privilege itself is far too divisive to be helpful. So I've actually stopped using the phrase, because there are many white people up and down the country, and indeed across the world, who do not feel privileged at all. And there are probably, in fact, I know there are a lot of white people who are a lot less privileged than I am. So if I was then to talk about white privilege to them, they would be rightly angry about it. So I think it's an unhelpful term for those reasons. That doesn't mean there aren't situations that I've been in myself, for example, where I go on television and say something, a white person says exactly the same thing as me on television. I get lots of racist and homophobic abuse underneath the clip of me that's been put out on social media, Instagram or Twitter or TikTok or whatever, and the white person doesn't get any of that abuse whatsoever. Someone might describe the white person in that situation as having white privilege in that very specific situation. So we are, in some senses, unfortunately in this country, still in some situations treated differently on the basis of our race. And I think that is what the rather clumsy term of white privilege tries to describe. On identity politics and it resulting in this sort of white identitarian backlash, I think it absolutely has. And I resent the fact that few people, when they started making these identity politics arguments, whether or not it was about sexuality, gender identity, race, whatever, I am surprised that all of these clever people with all of their degrees and doctorates didn't think that a potential backlash from this focus on immutable characteristics, on things that were skin deep, I'm surprised that these people didn't think, actually, maybe other people might start coming up with versions of this on their own. And now there is very much, I would say, this re-emergence of what you might call white nationalism, and people don't like it very much. I'm not surprised that it's happened. But I think the question is, how do we solve that problem? And again, that for me is an integration issue. We do live in a country now where a high proportion of the population, we're talking 60, 70, 80% of the population, think being racist is wrong. And people that want to be white nationalists need to be integrated back into that mainstream school of thought. So I think there's integration that needs to happen on both sides. You know, if you are in my view, a white nationalist who doesn't think someone like me can be English, who wants to deport people that for whatever reason you think can't be integrated into English or British or Western society, I would argue that you need to be integrated into the mainstream just as much as those people who are living in parallel communities in places like Bradford or Oldham, perhaps practicing customs like cousin marriage, using Sharia courts over the laws of the land. I would actually argue that they're two sides of the same coin. They're minorities of people with extreme views that need to be integrated into the mainstream, and that mainstream is largely colourblind in Britain today, and I think that's a brilliant thing.
I'm also delighted to be joined by Laurie Wastell on this important question of different forms of nationalism and national identity in modern Britain. So the first question that I want to ask him, and he'll give a 2 minutes introduction, is what does it mean to be English, and what really makes somebody English?
Yes, I do think, as this is a somewhat fraught question, or it can be at least, it's worth just getting some of the basic definitions out of the way, I think. So, of course, we had this debate recently about whether Rishi Sunak was English, and there was a lot of sort of feeling on both sides, really. And to some extent, this was a battle over identity, but it was also just a battle over correct terminology. And as a matter of social science, it's actually quite a simple question. Rishi Sunak is not ethnically English. That's obvious to anyone. If an ethnic group, if we want the definition, is a community which believes, ethnic groups are communities which believe themselves to be descended from common ancestors. Rishi Sunak is not ethnically English by this definition. He probably he could have English nationality. Probably more likely, the way that we have done it in Britain generally is to classify ethnic minorities as rather, in Asian British would be probably what he ticks on the census. So that's partly a debate over that. But essentially, nationality and ethnicity are not necessarily the same thing. Although, of course, it's true that, ethnicity does historically played a role in nationality. But I think one of the reasons to sort of remain on a fairly technical stance here for a second, one of the reasons that this debate gets very fraught is that people basically draw a false dichotomy from any recognition that ethnicity has historically played a role in the British state, and that it is important in English nationhood, to thinking that there can be no inclusion of ethnic minorities at all. And really, that's a false dichotomy, and we can sort of get a bit more into that later on, I think. But so, what has Englishness been to me? I would say, going back to that definition of ancestors, that's broadly how I think about it. I can trace one part of my family tree back to the 13th century. I know, for instance, that several of my ancestors were reverends, and when I'm in a church, I think that speaks to me. I can think, if we're doing events commemorating World War II, I can think of my ancestor that was at D-Day or World War One. In on the Western Front. Another one died in Gallipoli, and sort of there's more things I can think about there. But it's that I know when I'm walking around these islands, England, that my ancestors walked here before me. I think that is almost a line of T.S. Eliot, and that's another line that I do think about when I'm in churches. In particular, is that famous line, "History is now in England." It's sort of this idea of you are in a place where your ancestors lived, and I'm experiencing similar things to them, and I'm in a country that they built, essentially.
So, what do you say to those who say that it is mainly ethnic minorities or people that are visible minorities where their ethnic Englishness is questioned? Because I think some people point to some of the ancestry of the royal family, or even someone like Boris Johnson, who has ancestry that is actually quite mixed if you look at it genetically. But because they are not visible ethnic minorities, they don't necessarily have the same questioning of their ethnicity. Now, we know obviously Rishi Sunak's ethnicity because we know we know the man. But is it always so clear to assume what people's ancestry is, or is it always useful to think of it as something that's kind of fixed or always immediately noticeable?
Well, you're right that it's not completely fixed. I mean, one way of thinking about it is that these things they're always a bit blurry, the edges, and it's sort of always sort of hard to put the boundaries. I mean, you mentioned Boris Johnson. I think he has. I believe it's like one of his great grandparents is Turkish, so I mean I do think the majority of his ethnicity is English. I mean, for myself, I am, I think, 1/8 Welsh and 1/8 Irish. But this, the concept of an ethnic group is not like, firstly, it's not completely genetic. This is not quite the same, but it's more sort of how it's which group do you essentially trace your common ancestors to. But I mean, you're right that it's easier for someone like Boris Johnson, even if he has some other, I mean, even if he did probably genetic testing, not that that's the key thing, he would actually be majority English ethnicity anyway. But you're right, it's easier for white people to pass as English, and I mean that's just sort of a fact of life, really. But I think as a that's it.
So just moving on to an example that I've thought is quite interesting is the example of Israel. Because some people have argued that Israel is an example of a nation where nobody really, or very few people, question the ethnic importance of Israel as a nation. It explicitly defines itself as a homeland for the Jewish people, and it's also democratic. Obviously there's a debate about Israel going on at the moment, but generally speaking, it's regarded as a liberal democracy and one that prioritizes ethnicity in its sense of itself as a nation. What do you think about that example?
I think it's an example rather to go back to the sort of false dichotomy that I was trying to point out before. It's not Israel. It's true. Pays a great deal of attention to its demographics, and it's an objective of the Israeli state that the Jewish ethnic majority, which is about 75%, will not fall much lower than that, and that's because they are extremely interested in being able to have what they view as self-determination in that country, and not to be demographically outnumbered. But at the same time, Israel is not an ethno state. There's about 25%, most of which is Arab, which is non-Israeli Jewish. And it's wrong to claim this an apartheid state or anything else, as someone on the left tend to. But what that illustrates to me is that you can actually have a demographic policy as a country, and see that as an objective. I think that that's quite central to how you are as a nation, without it meaning that you are immediately expelling all people that are not of that ethnic group, or that you are necessarily hostile to them. So actually, contrary to the very fraught way this is often portrayed, it's not one or the other.
And what do you say to those who say that part of that perhaps there is that Israel has a coherent national story? So in some senses, I can see someone arguing that actually Israel does bring different Jews from different parts of the world, in the sense that whether that's Ethiopia all the way to like Poland, and they are, they look physically different, and have slightly different histories, but they've obviously got that shared story of their origin. And to what extent is that perhaps more of the thing that brings Israelis together, the shared story of struggle and survival, and to what extent can we take from that in the UK?
Yes, well, I think it's obviously they're slightly different, but it is a case of where ethnicity is somewhat different to genetics. But broadly, if you're thinking of yourself as ethnically Jewish, or as the Jewish state does, I don't think that actually matters very much about whether they're coming from part of Africa or anywhere else. I believe that it may play some role in culture, but essentially the question I believe that the Jewish state is asking is sort of what proportion of our country is tied into that story that you mentioned, believe themselves to be Jewish, believes that we have to fight for our homeland and things like this, even regardless of where they are on the political spectrum. And so, in some sense, ethnicity is less, or rather genetic history is less important there, but this is still an ethnic group. And that's sort of the relevant thing there. Obviously, well, I could talk about Britain as well, but that's slightly different.
Yeah, so just building on that, because I think that is really interesting, because some people, make the argument that the problem isn't so much, and I think this moves me on to the next question, isn't so much the extent to which Britain has a kind of white British ethnic majority, but that we have a deeply cohesive and deeply held shared national story, that regardless of where you come from, if you're an immigrant or immigrant heritage, or if you are indigenous to these isles, you really buy into that. So that kind of moves me on to my next question. Obviously, there is this research that is partly one of the reasons we're having this conversation, by Matthew Goodwin, on the fact that by the end of the century, white British people are projected to be a minority in Britain. And, it'd be interesting to know why you think that matters, and what the implications are of that.
Well, I think so. There's this idea of being a nation of immigrants, and that's an idea we really get from America, or the concept of it. And this is perhaps what applies more to Israel as well, in its current form. But this is really not true of Britain, and of England in particular. England is actually one of the oldest nations in the world. It's been essentially politically unified since 927. And I think we're often told that because of waves of migration, such as the Saxons, essentially, which gave rise to that, and the Normans or others, that we have always had a migration history. But that's not really right. I mean, the amount of inward migration from the Normans, for instance, was about like 8,000 people. There was obviously a transfer of elites, a very major cultural change. But the ethnic group of basically the English has existed pretty stably for over 1,000 years until basically 1948, when we saw a sort of slow and then accelerating ethnic change. So I think one of the problems with our immigration discourse today is that we try and buy into. In fact, we heard it rather bizarrely from David Bull recently, the new Reform chairman, this sort of leftist Americanized narrative of our national history, which is that we are, I think he said immigration is the lifeblood of our country. Well, no, that's not really true. It hasn't been. I mean, Britain has traditionally been a nation of emigration, and, that's why Australia, America, Canada and New Zealand exist, for instance. And that, so what you have in Britain is a long existing indigenous ethnic group, which is the state forming group. And so to suddenly say that, we've always been a nation of change, we've always had been a sort of community of communities, we've all, and all of the things that go with our present multicultural settlement, to sort of say that this is entirely continuous with our island story, if you like, it is what is wrong, and I think it is, it's a somewhat unstable way of trying to characterize our identity going forward. Well, I think they're not good overall. I mean, I think it's also important to think about sort of a nation as a concept and why nations exist, almost. And I think in a way, the way we like to think about this, or sort of a kind of post-war liberal paradigm, is very much against the idea of the nation, and sort of, this universalist idea that anyone can come in, and the ethnic identity is not very important. But the nation is one of the most sort of natural concepts in human history. Obviously, as I said, England is one of the oldest nations, but it's basically the idea that you have a people in a certain place that politically unifies in some way and then creates a state over itself to govern itself. And this is a very normal thing. I mean, this is normal in somewhere like Japan. This is normal in Nigeria. This is normal in China. This is kind of how humans tend to organize themselves, and there's a certain, pretty sound logic to that. And of course, we can compare that with places where there is a lot of ethnic diversity, and look at lots of examples throughout history. But this is generally gives rise to ethnic conflict in one way or another. I mean, one example might be, Yugoslavia after the fall of the Soviet Union. But we could think of plenty of others as well. And so it's a homogenous nation state, and we could sort of include England and Britain in this, maybe even sort of 25 years ago, with 10% of roughly of the country being ethnic minority. That's much less significant than what we're heading for at the moment, and that's, and as we've been seeing recently, we're getting sort of sectarian voting in the north of England from the Gaza independence, and we're set to get a lot more of that if we have a lot more ethnic change. And this kind of politics is much more low trust. It's sort of very fractious. I mean, we're seeing rioting of various kinds in the past few years, and literally just a couple of weeks ago in Ballymena. And so, a society with a high amount of ethnic diversity is going to be prone to these kinds of tensions and conflicts in a way that a homogenous one isn't.
Well, there you have it. Two sides of a very important discussion, which I don't think is going away anytime soon, nor necessarily should it. But we definitely need to address it and hopefully come to some kind of consensus as a society, because national identity, belonging, are really key to the extent to which people feel like This is the society that they want to be part of and invested in the future of the country, the past, the present, and the future. These are really big issues that we care about at the Equiano Project. But, you know, the future of our children is, and how they view themselves as part of a larger whole that they buy into is really, really important. So, as usual, tell us what you think. I mean, where do you stand in this discussion? What do you think we should be doing going forward? And what other voices do you think we should be hearing? And what other elements of this topic should we be talking about? Thank you so much. I'm Anaya Flaren Iman, and this is The Flip Side.